Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Francesca Gino, a behavioral scientist and professor at Harvard Business School. She is the author of Rebel Talent. I've been so excited to talk to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is going to be fun. You're welcome. You are studying a lot of the things that I'm very much interested in, and I know we're going to get into curiosity in a little bit. But your latest book, I got to watch some of your work. You did a great job at your talk to Google. Found that really fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you talk about being a rebel, and I love that because it's not status quo thinking, which is what I'm interested in. And I would like to just, before we get into that a little bit, can you just give a little background? I mean, how do you get to be a Harvard Business School professor? That's a pretty big deal. So just give me a little bit of background, if you wouldn't mind.
It's a bit by chance, which makes me smile in saying that. But I had started doing my PhD back in Italy, and as part of this program, they were trying to be experimental, and the idea was to go abroad to start working on a dissertation. And I decided instead to leave in my second year, and I decided to come to Harvard as a visiting student. And the short of it is that I never went back. I just love the people that I met here. They were really supportive. They were really interesting. And so I ended up doing research with them and sticking around rather than going back.
Well, I could see why. I mean, I've had a lot of really great Harvard professors. Just had Ellen Langer, John Cotter. I'm thinking of all the people who've been on my show. And I've always wanted to go visit Harvard. And when I was actually out that way, close to that, I ended up at MIT. You got to see that. I never did get to see Harvard, but it's on my list. It's on my list. But I love your book. I love the idea of the rebel talent. What made you interested in writing that?
For many years, I studied rule breaking in the moral sphere. So I was looking at people who cheat, steal, lie, and I was trying to understand what it is that organizations could do to prevent that, to make sure that people do not engage in misconduct. And in time, I started to notice a different side of rule breaking. So people who, yes, break the rules, but end up driving positive change and doing something really constructive for their organizations. And so these were people who did not lie or cheat. Instead, they were quite genuine in their spirit of rebellion, and they were coming up with all sorts of creative ideas and innovative way of thinking. And so that's where I turn my attention to try to decode the recipe to success.
Well, I like that. And you use words that people probably think of for rebels, like show-offs, jerks, annoying troublemakers, outcasts. Where does Steve Jobs fall into all of that? You mentioned that a little bit in your talk.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have this very precise idea of who the rebels are in business. And so when I ask people to think about the rebels, they often mention Steve Jobs. And yes, he's an incredibly creative, innovative thinker. But if you pay attention to the stories, is also not a person that you might want to have as an employee or as a colleague or as a boss. Not so easy to work with. And so I was interested in looking at rebels who are not only effective in the way of creativity innovations, but they're also good to have around in terms of the interactions that you're going to have with them. So when I think about rebels, one of the people that come to mind that really inspired the project in my mind is the chef and owner of a 3 Michelin star restaurant that became the best restaurant in the world in 2016. And then again in 2018, and it's an Italian restaurant called Osteria Francescana. And what's interesting about this chef is that he went to traditional Italian dishes and decided to reinvent them. Now, I'm not sure how much you know about Italians, but two things are true. There are lots of rules when it comes to cooking, from the way you pair a certain sauce to a certain type of pasta, and Second, we cherish our old ways, especially when it comes to traditional dishes, to recipes that have been passed on for generations. And so here you had a chef who basically went to this almost sacred context and started asking questions with a lot of curiosity and said, why is it that we cook the dishes this way? Maybe made sense 20 years ago, but not today. And so he came up with his own version of the dishes that are quite innovative and has been very successful. That's a type of rebel that you'd find in the book.
Well, where is this restaurant located?
It's in Modena, Italy.
Ah, well, my husband's going to want to try that. My husband and I both are half Italian on our mother's side. So if your mother's Italian, you're Italian, basically, and that's what we've discovered. But we would kind of discuss whose sauce was better at the Christmas time. So we kind of went with my sauce and his meatballs, and we kind of combined it. So we've met in the middle on that one. But I think there's something really important to say about that. The talents that you share in your book. And you said that rebels share 5 talents. And you want to share what those are?
Yes, they're a talent for novelty, a talent for curiosity, a talent for perspective, a talent for diversity, and a talent for authenticity.
And they're really important, all of them. But guess which one I want to focus on?
Curiosity.
Right. And I loved how much your HBR article was shared. I mean, it was just everywhere. And my curiosity was piqued because every time I saw it, there was a different graphic associated with it. Did you do that on purpose, or did that just...
I did not.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that used to be a cat, and now it's a different kind of cat. And I started following it on different sites to see what somebody was either changing the default graphic, or you did some technology that I got to figure out. I was very fascinated by that. But your article was titled "The Business Case for Curiosity," and as I said, is an HBR. And you talk about important insights about curiosity as it relates to business. And I would like to know a little bit about your survey you did of more than 3,000 employees and what you were trying to find from that.
What I was interested in is trying to understand, why is it that if I think about all the leaders I talk to or I have in my classes, they seem to recognize that curiosity is important. And they seem to always agree with the fact that if we think about making sure that people stay engaged in the work that they do and they come up with creative ideas, curiosity is definitely an important ingredient. And yet, somehow the data tells a different story. So when I collected data from this sample of over 3,000 employees from all sorts of industries and firms, what I found is that only about 24% of them indicated feeling curious in their job on a regular basis. And more than 70% of them said that they face barriers as to staying curious and asking more questions at work. That's puzzling. Because again, on the other side, you have these leaders who say, well, definitely curiosity is important to the business. And so I wanted to try to understand why there is such a mismatch, right, and what it is that leaders need to do in order to really model curiosity and encourage curiosity in their businesses.
Well, that's exactly what was driving me crazy. And when I was researching, I wrote a book called Cracking the Curiosity Code, and I created this assessment, the Curiosity Code Index, because I looked at some of the curiosity assessments out there, and they were all kind of based on how curious, if you were curious or not, kind of levels. And I wanted to find out what kept people from being curious. And so that's what I was measuring. And I found 4 factors impacted curiosity, which were fear, assumptions, technology, and environment. And a lot of what, environmental things fall into the boss kind of shutting you down too, but it also overlapped a little bit with fear, because you have fear of the boss shutting you down. And yeah, it was really fascinating to me to do this research. So that's why I was really excited to discuss with you, why it's so important. What do you think the benefits of curiosity are? And, how did you, I'd love to know how you assess the impact of it on innovation as well.
Yeah, so there are all sorts of interesting recent studies on curiosity that show that it can be quite beneficial. So first, to maybe what might appear an obvious finding, but I think it's actually quite thoughtful and important. There is research that shows that, in fact, curiosity is an important driver of innovation and creative thinking. And this is a research that uses both data that comes from experimental studies, where it's easier to measure curiosity of a product or of creativity of an idea, but also from field work, where you can look at, for instance, how innovative products are that are put on websites for sale. So if you think about a website like Etsy, for instance, you can look at the products and judge them for their creativity and how much innovative they are. So that's one side. So research linking curiosity to innovation. But then there is also research that looks at how curiosity can improve decision making. So, for example, in my own research, what I found is that when people uh, feel curious, or when their curiosity is encouraged and triggered, they're much less likely to engage in a very common bias that affects our decisions, which is the confirmation bias. So you're basically looking for information that tend to suggest that you're right, rather than
Uh-huh.
looking for information that might tell you that you're wrong. And so curiosity seems to have all these positive effects on our decision making processes because it helps us consider alternatives. When we're curious, it's not that we are focusing on one answer, an obvious one. We're thinking much more broadly about alternatives, and with that comes better decision making.
Uh,
And then there is research done inside of teams and groups showing the curiosity is important there also, because maybe surprisingly, when we're curious, we end up working more collaboratively. And part of why that happens is that with curiosity comes the questions asking. And so we're much more likely to uncover information that is important to solve problems within a team or within a groups.
Well, it's interesting to me to see some of the benefits. I mean, team, all the team work, things like that. But also, I'm interested in just how it correlated with like reactions to stress and empathy, and some of the things you do. I ever actually wrote my dissertation on emotional intelligence, which got me interested in all these
Mm.
personality trait, behavioral type of things. And I think it's a big part of helping with empathy. And I saw you mention that. What did you find with that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting.
Hmm.
We, I also looked at how curiosity can reduce conflict inside of groups or inside of teams, inside of collaborations. And that is because when you're curious, you don't get stuck on only your perspective of the issue of the problem, but you end up being more open to the perspective and view of others. So it's very much linked to this idea of empathy, and even to the idea of humility, that all of a sudden you're coming into an interaction not thinking that you have all the right answers, but
Hmm.
that others might be helpful too.
I love that. And I think that the impact of curiosity is something that I think we've been talking about, curiosity for a long time. I mean, if you ask Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, they all say, that's what made them successful to some extent.
Mm,
But do you think curiosity is the spark to motivation? Which comes first in your mind?
that's a really interesting question.
It's a hard
To
one, isn't it?
me,
Sorry.
yeah, it is a hard one. So if um, and I'm not. I was trying to think whether what kind of evidence that is to support one
Hmm.
versus the other.
Hmm.
In my mind, curiosity comes first, because
Hmm.
with curiosity you have this desire to explore, you have this desire to reach out.
Hmm.
So I have some right hot off the press data that is actually quite interesting, that shows that curiosity leads us to diversify our networks and thus collaborate with others more effectively. And so, if you think about it, what curiosity does is almost as if it's increasing the motivation to reach out to other people or explore problems from a different angle. So, I would put that first.
Well, that's what I was finding in my research, and I thought it was really interesting because it seems like all the problems that organizations have, like from everything from innovation, critical thinking, everything kept coming back to curiosity to me. So that was why I was so fascinated by it. And I love some of the stories you shared about like Ford and GM and how curiosity declines after being in a job for a while. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I was looking at data from children development, and partly because I have three small children, and so I was approaching the data with a curious eye. And what the data shows is that we're all born with a lot of curiosity. And in fact, curiosity tends to peak at the age of 4 and 5. And then unfortunately, it declines steadily from there. And so I started thinking that maybe when children enter their schools and there is a lot of focus on getting things done and learning to detest, that those might be factors that push curiosity away. And so I started thinking that maybe in an organization you would see a similar phenomenon. And so I looked at hundreds of employees joining a new organization, so across industries, across jobs, and I measured their level of curiosity. There are great scales now that we can use to assess curiosity. And then I went back to the same people 6 to 8 months later. And what was surprising is that there was a decline. In fact, across the board, curiosity dropped by at least 20%.
Wow.
And it's a missed opportunity for all the good things and reasons we mentioned earlier. Curiosity can have such a powerful effect in organizations, and it seemed puzzling that so much of our curiosity gets shut down as we enter new jobs.
Well, I think a lot of what I hear is, especially from older people that have been in the, around in the workplace for a long time, is that they used to look at it as insubordination if people asked questions, it was something that I'm seeing a change in younger generations. Have you seen that at all, or is that just my experience?
So, what I think is interesting about the new generation is less patience in a sense for organizations that um, where you find yourself working and you don't feel excited or satisfied. So I think that thanks to all the technology that is now available to us, it's easier to find or be aware of jobs where others could be feeling better about the work that they do. And so I think that it's easier for people to jump and sort of say, okay, I'm not going to tolerate this, I'm going to move on.
Right. Well, we used to have to stay. I had a job for 20 years. You never hear about that anymore. And things are definitely changing. And I'm really interested in ways that we can help people with this, to build their curiosity, to make them feel more engaged at work. Because another thing I thought came back to curiosity was engagement. But you say there's 5 ways to bolster curiosity in that article, at least. And I'm curious if you want to share some of them.
Yeah, it's again, I was interested like you in not only pointing to a possible problem, but making sure that we could solve
Right.
the curiosity crisis, if you will.
Uh-huh.
So what I was trying to suggest is that there are very simple solutions. So, for instance, in most organizations I worked with or did research with, I noticed that people tend to have performance goals, which is great. We want to make sure that people perform
Right.
according to certain expectations, but a missed opportunity that would allow to keep curiosity alive is emphasizing learning goals. And so, by the very fact that you in your job not only have performance goals, but you also have learning goals, can be quite helpful in keeping curiosity alive. And those could be decided. Sorry, those could be decided in discussions with your boss or with your colleagues, but it's important for them to be identified so that you're not just performing in your job, but you're also thinking about what it is that you're learning. So that's one. Another one is to be the first one to model for curiosity or to model inquisitiveness, as I call it in the article. It's so easy for all of us to, again, feel the pressure in the job that we do, that we don't exploit or use opportunities where we can model curiosity for others. Like, for example, rather than just entering a meeting with a clear sense of what we should be doing, what if we were the first to saying, but why is it that we're going down this path? Or how is it? And we offer other alternatives. So there are simple moments in the life of every leader that can actually make a difference because we're modeling a behavior for others. And modeling is really contagious. So that would be one. And another one that I quite like that I've seen in a few different organizations is the idea of exploring and broadening people's interests. So giving people the opportunity to explore something that is not tightly related to the work that they do. And so companies have done this in different ways. So for example, there are organizations that give some money or tuitions to their workers so that they can get degrees that again might not be necessarily helpful for the job that they have, but allow them to explore interests. Or there is an Italian organization that gives people, they call it a cultural budget, so that you can go to museums or other artistic type event just to open your mind, and those are paid by the company itself. And so to the extent that it's possible to broaden people's interests and broaden their perspective, that is an interesting opportunity for leaders.
Well, you gave a lot of really interesting examples in your writing, and I think I like the one about Captain Sully. You got to actually talk to him about that. What did you learn from talking to him about curiosity?
I first met him in a sense as I was reading the accident report on this famous flight in the cold evening of 2009. And what was fascinating is that here you had a person who had 208 seconds to make a decision. That's very little time.
Yeah.
And in a situations where you have no thrust in the engines and you're actually flying, you're also under a lot of stress. And what I noticed as I was reading the accident report, and so you get to see the communications between him and his first officer, and also between him and the air traffic controller, is that he was considering all sorts of options. And that's striking because for anybody who knows anything about psychology, what we know is that under that time pressure and that level of anxiety and stress, we tend to narrow our options. We go to the most obvious answer, which in this case probably would have been land at the closest airport.
Right.
And he instead kept considering alternatives. And when I reached out to him, I discovered that by the time he had the accident, he had tons of experience under his belt. He had over 30,000 hours of flying experience. He had served in the military, so he had experience flying all sorts of planes. He also served as a volunteer in teams analyzing previous accidents, so he had lots of knowledge about what it is that can go wrong on a plane. But despite all of that, every time he walked into the cockpit, he would ask himself what it is that could be different here, what's left to learn. And so it's a beautiful example of a person who made learning goals a really important aspect of his career and his job. And rather than thinking of experience as a sign or as a signal that he has all the answer, he always looked at it by saying, there is more for me to learn. And that is just beautiful.
Well, I think that's an amazing outcome, and it shows exactly, why it's so important to open up our minds to different things. And you had other examples. You had MIT's Bob Langer, how he raises curiosity with his students, and different ones. Was there any other one that stood out in your mind? Really, was somebody that's doing something amazing with opening up people's minds to curiosity?
It's interesting that you mentioned Bob Langer. Since one of the things that he does in his lab is that we are quite quick in judging others' ideas or judging others' perspective. We fundamentally come to an interaction thinking that our perspective is the best one or our ideas are the best one. And so what he does to avoid this challenge is raising questions about the ideas that are being discussed. And so it's basically asking people to consider more deeply every one of the ideas that are part of the discussion. And so it's really modeling a behavior that they expect others in the lab. And so it goes back to this idea of making sure that we take on every single opportunity that we have um, to model behavior that we want to see in others.
Well, I'm curious about one more thing with curiosity, and it wasn't really in your article, because I've been doing some work with perception. What do you see as the relationship between curiosity, perception, or what factors do you think impact perception, if not curiosity, and some other things?
And you're thinking perception of what more specifically?
Well,
is it just perception in generally, or do you have a concrete example?
I'm just saying, like in the working world, how you're looking at becoming aware of things, of opportunities, just how you get along with others.
Yeah.
For work, if you say you wanted to run a business you start up a branch in another country, and your perception of how things are in general versus how it is to do business with another culture. And I don't look at it just like a cultural quotient, because I think that there's more to it, with senses and everything else. Have you done any research with perception? I'm just like to get your insight on that one.
Yeah, my sense is that I would expect for the relationship to be positive, because one of the good things that curiosity does for us that is quite beneficial is allowing us to keep asking ourselves, I wonder if, and it's that type of thinking that leads you to consider multiple alternatives just than one. And so I would imagine that in the face of a certain challenge or a new job, that you're much more likely to have multiple perspectives in looking at the same problem or the same situation if you were a curious person, or if your curiosity was triggered.
Yeah, it's interesting because that brings up critical thinking skills, and I think that perception is influenced by that ability, and so that's something I'm interested in working on. And all of this that you've brought up has been really fascinating to me, and I'm really appreciative that you were able to share all this on this show today. And I think a lot of people want to read your book. I know your work has been very inspiring to me, and I couldn't believe it when I saw your article after I wrote all this. I'm like, I wish I could have read that before I wrote it all, because it would have really helped me, because I'm like, oh good, this was verifying that I found this was right and this was right, and so it was very good for me. And I really appreciate you being on the show. So I know a lot of people are going to want to know how to get your book and find out more. Is there a link you'd like to share?
Yes, there is a link to the book website, is rebeltalents.org, so with an S. And on the book website, they can find links to how to buy the book, and they can also find a link to a test. I call it the Rebel Test. And over 65,000 people have taken the test so far, and it's free. It takes just a few minutes. But for people who are interested to get started on this rebel journey, it's important for all of us to understand which talents come to us more naturally than others. And so the test was created with the intention of helping all of us get started by understanding our tendencies a little bit better.
Well, that's awesome. I have to take that. I can't believe I haven't taken it. That's on my list. But
I bet you're a pirate. I'm
a pirate?
Discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, and if that is the case, it's a very good thing.
Oh, good. Well, that's good to know. Well, I'm definitely going to take it now. I got to find out. But thank you so much for being on this show. This has been so fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me. Really fun talking to you.
You're welcome. And we'll be back right after this message.